Underneath the dim, flickering neon light of Benny's all-night diner, 11-year-old Zeke Harper hesitated at the entrance. A soft breeze tugged at his oversized hoodie, which was far too thin to ward off the cold January morning. His sneakers, scuffed and worn, shuffled on the pavement as he struggled to summon the courage to step inside. The aroma of coffee and sizzling bacon wafted out each time the door swung open, tantalizing and cruel to a boy who hadn't eaten a proper meal in over 24 hours. Clutching the frayed edges of his hoodie, Zeke took a deep breath and slipped through the door, unnoticed by the few patrons seated inside. His heart pounded in his chest as his eyes scanned the small diner. In the corner booth, seated beneath a hanging light that cast a soft glow over his figure, was Mr. Everett Carmichael. The man was every inch the definition of success. His tailored navy suit clung perfectly to his athletic build, and a glimmering gold watch peeked out from beneath his cuff. He was engrossed in the business section of the New York Times, a steaming black coffee untouched at his side. Everything about him screamed wealth and power, and Zeke knew this was the man he had been waiting for. For weeks, Zeke had watched Mr. Carmichael. He'd seen him sip his coffee in this very booth every morning at exactly 7:15 a.m., scanning the headlines with the same sharp intensity he imagined the man approached everything in life. Zeke had spent hours mustering the courage to approach him, rehearsing his words in the empty alley behind the diner. Today, there was no room for fear. Today, his grandmother's life depended on it. The small diner hummed with faint sounds of clinking utensils and muffled conversations. A waitress with tired eyes and a pen tucked behind her ear moved between tables, refilling mugs of coffee. The scent of grease lingered in the air. Zeke swallowed hard and shuffled toward an empty table a few feet away from Mr. Carmichael's booth. He sat down, the vinyl seat cold and cracked beneath him. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of the table, sticky with syrup residue. Glancing at the clock on the wall, he realized he had been sitting there for several minutes without moving. Every second that passed felt like another lost chance. His grandmother's face flashed in his mind, her frail body lying motionless on the worn couch back at their tiny apartment. The image burned into his thoughts, fueling his resolve. Zeke clenched his fists. He couldn't fail, not today. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling as he approached Mr. Carmichael's table. The man didn't look up, his piercing eyes fixed on the article in front of him. The closer Zeke got, the heavier his steps felt, like his worn-out sneakers were made of lead. Excuse me, sir." Zeke's voice was barely above a whisper. His throat felt dry, the words scratching as they came out. Mr. Carmichael didn't respond, his hand turning the page of the newspaper with a deliberate flick. Zeke froze, his courage faltering for a moment. What if he didn't listen? What if he told him to leave? Zeke took a step closer, summoning every ounce of strength he had left. "Please, sir," he said, louder this time. His voice cracked and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I just need a minute of your time." This time, Mr. Carmichael's sharp, gray eyes flicked up from the paper, locking onto Zeke. His expression was unreadable, neither welcoming nor hostile. "What is it, kid?" he asked, his voice calm but clipped, like he was already dismissing whatever Zeke had. Zeke hesitated, his gaze falling to the table. The 4 words he had rehearsed echoed in his mind like a mantra. "Help my family, please." But now, standing in front of this man, they felt so small, so inadequate. "I'm not okay," Zeke began, his voice shaking. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to meet Mr. Carmichael's gaze. "I need your help." Mr. Carmichael raised an eyebrow, leaning back slightly in his seat. "Help?" he repeated, his tone laced with skepticism. "What kind of help?" Zeke's hands trembled as he reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled prescription slip. He smoothed it out on the table, the creases barely hiding the desperation in his actions. "It's for my grandma," he said quickly, his words tumbling out in a rush. "She's sick, really sick. The doctor gave us this prescription, but we can't afford the medicine. I don't know what else to do." For a moment, there was silence. The hum of the diner seemed to fade, and all Zeke could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat. Mr. Carmichael's eyes flicked to the prescription, then back to Zeke. His expression remained unreadable. And you thought I'd be the one to help you? Mr. Carmichael asked, his voice measured. Zeke's face flushed, but he didn't look away. I see you here every day, he said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at his stomach. You look like someone who can make a difference. I don't have anyone else to ask. Mr. Carmichael studied him for a long moment, his gaze piercing. Finally, he folded his newspaper and set it aside, leaning forward slightly. What's your name, kid? Zeke, he replied. Ezekiel Harper. And how old are you, Ezekiel? 11, Zeke said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I'll be 12 in a few months. Mr. Carmichael sighed, running a hand over his face. 11, he muttered to himself. He glanced around the diner, as if searching for someone to intervene, but all eyes were on them. Even the waitress had paused her rounds, pretending to wipe down a table as she watched the exchange. Leaning back in his seat, Mr. Carmichael tapped his fingers on the edge of the table. All right, Ezekiel, he said finally. I'll listen. But if this is some kind of scam? It's not, Zeke interrupted, his voice trembling but firm. I swear it's not. I'll show you where we live, where she is. I'm not lying. As Zeke spoke, his voice raw with emotion, the entire diner seemed to hold its breath. The waitress stopped pretending to wipe the table, her eyes soft with concern. Even the cook, who had been flipping pancakes at the grill, paused to watch. Mr. Carmichael studied the boy in front of him, the desperation in his voice, the tears threatening to spill over. Finally, he exhaled, his expression softening just slightly. All right, he said, let's start with the basics. Sit down, kid. Zeke nodded quickly, sliding into the booth across from him. His hands fidgeted in his lap as he waited for Mr. Carmichael to speak. You said your grandmother's sick, Mr. Carmichael began, his tone serious. How bad is it? Zeke swallowed hard. She can't get out of bed most days, he admitted. She's in so much pain, and we don't have the money for her medicine. I tried to save up, but it's not enough. I don't know what else to do. Mr. Carmichael nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Zeke's face. And your parents? He asked. Where are they? Zeke's throat tightened, and he looked down at his hands. They died, he said softly. 2 months ago, car accident. For the first time, Mr. Carmichael's expression shifted, his brow furrowed, and a flicker of something, sympathy maybe, crossed his face. He leaned back in his seat, letting out a slow breath. Zeke's heart leapt in his chest. You mean it? He asked, his voice filled with hope. I said I'll help, Mr. Carmichael replied, pulling out his phone. Now, your address? Zeke quickly rattled off the address of their small apartment in the Bronx. Mr. Carmichael entered it into his phone, then stood, signaling to the security guard near the door. The guard approached, his posture stiff and professional. Have someone check out this address, Mr. Carmichael instructed, showing the guard the screen. I want to know if there's an elderly woman there and what condition she's in. The guard nodded, taking the phone to make the call. As he stepped away, Mr. Carmichael turned back to Zeke. All right, kid, he said. Now we wait. As the diner emptied out into the quieter hours of mid-morning, the tension between Tommy and Mr. Anderson subtly shifted. The air was still heavy with uncertainty, but it no longer felt oppressive. Instead, there was a strange sense of opportunity lingering. Tommy wasn't sure if it was hope or just exhaustion, but he decided to embrace it. Mr. Anderson sat back in the booth, his gold watch catching the sunlight as he folded his arms. There's one more thing I need to ask, he said after a long pause. How much do you trust your neighbors? Tommy blinked, confused. Trust them? I mean, they're nice enough, but everyone keeps to themselves. Why? Mr. Anderson tapped his fingers on the table, his expression thoughtful. If you're gonna be away from the apartment for long stretches, whether it's because of school or visiting your grandmother, we need to make sure it's secure. I don't want you worrying about coming back to find things missing or worse. Tommy frowned. I've never thought about that. There's not much left to take anyway. Even so, Mr. Anderson said, his voice steady, your home, no matter how small or run down, is your sanctuary. You need to feel safe. Tommy didn't know how to respond. The idea of someone caring about his safety in this way was foreign to him. He wasn't used to being a priority in anyone's plan. "I'll have someone check the locks and make sure everything's secure," Mr. Anderson continued. "It's a small step, but it matters." Tommy nodded slowly, still processing everything. "Thank you," he said quietly. Just as Tommy was about to ask another question, the bell above the diner's entrance jingled and a tall woman in her late 40s stepped inside. She was dressed in a sharp navy suit, her hair pulled back into a neat bun. She carried a leather briefcase in one hand and a purposeful expression on her face. "Mr. Anderson," she greeted, her voice clipped but professional. Tommy watched as Mr. Anderson rose to his feet and extended a hand. "Linda," he said, his tone unusually warm. "Thanks for coming on such short notice." Linda glanced at Tommy, her eyes sharp and assessing. "This must be the boy," she said. "Tommy, is it?" Tommy nodded, feeling suddenly small under her scrutinizing gaze. "Yes, ma'am." Linda's expression softened slightly. "I'm Linda Porter, Mr. Anderson's legal counsel. He's filled me in on your situation, and I'm here to help." Tommy glanced at Mr. Anderson, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," he mumbled, not knowing what else to say. Linda slid into the booth across from Tommy, setting her briefcase on the table. "We have a lot to discuss," she began. "First, I'll need to confirm a few details about your living situation and your grandmother's condition. Once we have that information, we can start working on a more permanent solution." Tommy hesitated, his stomach twisting. Is this about taking me away from my grandmother?" Linda shook her head firmly. "Not necessarily. Our goal is to keep you together, but we also need to ensure you're both in a safe and stable environment. Right now, that means figuring out what resources we can tap into." Mr. Anderson leaned forward, his expression serious. "Linda's one of the best in her field," he said. "She's helped me navigate some of the toughest situations I've ever faced. If anyone can figure this out, it's her." Tommy nodded, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. He still didn't fully understand why Mr. Anderson was going to such lengths for him, but he was grateful nonetheless. Later that afternoon, Mr. Anderson's phone buzzed again, and he excused himself to take the call. When he returned, his expression was unreadable. "The clinic just updated me," he said, sliding back into the booth. "Your grandmother is stable, but the tests revealed something we weren't expecting." Tommy's heart sank. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Anderson hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "The doctors suspect she may have been misdiagnosed months ago. They're running additional tests to confirm, but it's possible her condition is more treatable than we initially thought." Tommy's eyes widened. "So, she might not be as sick as we thought?" "Possibly," Mr. Anderson said, "but we need to be cautious. Even if the new diagnosis is correct, she'll still need surgery and ongoing care. The good news is that the prognosis could be better than we expected." Tommy felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered by the weight of everything else. "When will they know for sure?" "By tomorrow morning," Mr. Anderson replied. "We'll visit her then, once the tests are complete." As the conversation continued, Tommy noticed something, or someone, just outside the diner. A man in a dark hoodie was lingering near the window, his face obscured. Tommy couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching them. "Mr. Anderson," Tommy said quietly, nodding toward the window. "Do you see that guy?" Mr. Anderson followed Tommy's gaze, his expression darkening. "Stay here," he said, rising from the booth. Tommy watched as Mr. Anderson stepped outside, his posture tense. Linda, who had been reviewing documents at the table, immediately looked up. "What's going on?" she asked. "There's a man outside," Tommy said, his voice tight. "Mr. Anderson went to check it out." Linda's expression hardened. "Stay put," she instructed, rising to her feet. Through the window, Tommy could see Mr. Anderson speaking to the man in the hoodie. Their exchange was brief, but the tension was palpable. Eventually, the man walked away, disappearing into the crowd. When Mr. Anderson returned, his jaw was clenched. "Nothing to worry about," he said curtly. "Just someone loitering." But Tommy wasn't convinced. There was something in Mr. Anderson's tone that suggested he wasn't telling the whole truth. As the day wore on, Linda outlined a plan for Tommy's immediate future. For now, she said, we'll focus on stabilizing your grandmother's health and securing temporary guardianship for you. Once she's well enough, we'll reassess the situation and explore long-term options. Tommy nodded, trying to absorb everything. It was a lot to take in, but he trusted Linda and Mr. Anderson to guide him. There's one more thing, Linda added, her tone hesitant. We'll need to file a report with Child Protective Services to document the steps we're taking. It's standard procedure, but it might attract some attention. What kind of attention? Tommy asked nervously. Nothing you need to worry about, Linda assured him. It's just part of the process. But the look Mr. Anderson exchanged with Linda suggested otherwise. Tommy couldn't shake the feeling that there were complications they weren't telling him about. The next morning, as they prepared to visit the clinic, the waitress from the dinner approached the table. I heard what's been going on, she said. Her voice soft but steady. If you need anything at all, just let me. Tommy was taken aback. He barely knew the waitress, but her kindness was evident. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She smiled warmly. You're a good kid. Don't forget that. Mr. Anderson nodded his thanks, and the waitress returned to her duties. Tommy couldn't explain it, but her words stayed with him. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he wasn't entirely alone. When they arrived at the clinic, the doctors confirmed the new diagnosis. Tommy's grandmother had a condition that was indeed treatable, but it required immediate surgery and a lengthy recovery process. The prognosis was positive, but the journey ahead would be challenging. As they discussed the treatment plan, a nurse entered the room with a letter. This was left for you, she said, handing it to Mr. Anderson. He opened the envelope, his expression darkening as he read the contents. What is it? Tommy asked, his heart pounding. Mr. Anderson handed the letter to Linda, who read it quickly. Her face was pale when she finished. It's a threat, she said grimly. Someone doesn't want us digging into Tommy's situation. Tommy felt his stomach drop. Who? Why? We'll figure it out, Mr. Anderson said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. But for now, the focus stays on your grandmother. As they left the clinic, Tommy couldn't shake the feeling that his world was about to change, in ways he couldn't predict. But with Mr. Anderson and Linda by his side, he felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time in a long time, he believed that things might actually get better. As the three of them stepped out of the diner and into the bright afternoon sunlight, Tommy noticed the faint scent of rain in the air. Clouds were gathering on the horizon, their edges dark and heavy, threatening an eventual storm. It felt fitting, given the whirlwind of emotions still brewing inside him. Mr. Anderson gestured toward a black sedan parked at the curb. We'll take my car, he said. Linda can brief you on what's next while we drive. Tommy hesitated, then climbed into the back seat, the leather interior feeling far too luxurious for someone like him. Linda slid into the passenger seat, pulling out a tablet and tapping the screen with precision. Here's what we're working with, Linda began as Mr. Anderson started the car. First, I'll need to contact your school. I'll ensure they're aware of the circumstances so they don't flag your absences or worse, attempt to intervene unnecessarily. Second, I've reached out to a trusted social worker to help navigate the system discreetly. Tommy's hands tightened on the seatbelt. Will they try to take me away? Linda turned to face him, her expression calm but serious. Not if we handle this properly. That's why we're involving people we trust, to ensure no one makes decisions without consulting us first. You're not a case file to be shuffled around. You're a person, Tommy, and we'll make sure they treat you like one. Mr. Anderson's steady voice cut in. She's right, and if anyone tries otherwise, they'll answer to me. Tommy nodded, though the unease in his chest didn't entirely fade. As the car rolled down the quiet streets, he stared out the window, watching the familiar yet distant world pass by. He couldn't help but wonder how his life had spiraled into this strange, surreal situation. They stopped at a public library on the outskirts of town, its weathered brick facade standing out against the steel and glass of the nearby buildings. Mr. Anderson led the way inside, the faint smell of old books and polished wood welcoming them. "This is one of my favorite places," Mr. Anderson said, his voice softer than usual. "A library is more than just a building. It's a refuge. I thought you might appreciate it." Tommy wasn't sure what to say. He hadn't been in a library since elementary school, but the quiet, peaceful atmosphere was comforting. He followed Mr. Anderson to a corner of the building where a row of desks sat beneath tall windows. Linda placed her briefcase on one of the desks and began spreading out papers. "While we're here, let's go over a few things," she said, motioning for Tommy to sit. "We'll need to document your living situation and any important details about your grandmother's medical history." Tommy hesitated, then sat across from her. As he answered her questions, he found himself opening up more than he expected. There was something about Linda's direct but compassionate approach that made him feel safe, even as they discussed difficult topics. By the time they finished, the sun was beginning to set, casting golden light through the library's tall windows. For a brief moment, Tommy felt a sense of calm. Maybe, just maybe, things would turn out okay. As they exited the library, the storm clouds that had been gathering all afternoon finally began to break. A light drizzle fell, the air cool and damp. "Here," Mr. Anderson said, his tone suddenly sharp. He walked a few steps ahead, his eyes scanning the street. Tommy followed his gaze and spotted a man leaning against a lamppost across the road. The man's face was obscured by the hood of his jacket, but there was something unsettling about the way he stood, as if he were waiting for something or someone. "Is that the same guy from earlier?" Tommy asked, his voice low. Linda's expression darkened. "It might be. Stay close to us, Tommy." Before Tommy could ask more, the man turned and disappeared down a side street, leaving nothing but an eerie silence in his wake. Mr. Anderson returned, his jaw tight. "Let's get moving," he said. "We'll talk about this later." That evening, back at the diner, Tommy was quietly sipping on a soda when the door jingled again. This time, a young woman in her mid-20s stepped in. She was dressed casually in a green sweater and jeans, her auburn hair pulled into a loose braid. She carried a messenger bag slung over one shoulder, and her eyes were warm but cautious. "Excuse me," she said, approaching their booth. "Are you Mr. Anderson?" Mr. Anderson glanced up, his expression curious but guarded. "Yes. Can I help you?" The woman nodded. "My name's Emily Carter. I'm a social worker. Linda Porter mentioned you might need my help." Linda smiled faintly. "Good timing, Emily. We were just about to go over the next steps." Emily turned to Tommy, her smile softening. "You must be Tommy. It's nice to meet you." Tommy shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but managed a small nod. Emily sat down with them, pulling out a notebook. "First off, I want you to know I'm here to help, not to judge or make decisions for you. My job is to make sure you and your grandmother get the support you need." Tommy studied her carefully. She seemed sincere, but he couldn't help feeling wary. "Why are you helping us?" he asked. Emily's smile didn't waver. "Because everyone deserves a chance, Tommy. And sometimes the system needs a little push in the right direction. That's where I come in." As the conversation continued, Emily brought up a possibility that none of them had considered before. "There's a program for families in your situation," she said. "It's designed to provide short-term housing and medical support while a more permanent solution is found. It's not perfect, but it could buy you some time." Mr. Anderson frowned. "What's the catch?" Emily shrugged. "There's always red tape, but with Linda's help, we can cut through it. The bigger challenge is getting your grandmother to agree. She might not want to leave her home, even temporarily." Tommy felt a lump form in his throat. "She's really stubborn about stuff like that," he admitted. Emily nodded sympathetically. "That's normal. But if we explain it as a way to keep you both together, she might come around." Tommy glanced at Mr. Anderson and Linda, both of whom seemed deep in thought. For the first time, he felt like there was a plan, a real plan, coming together, and even though it scared him, it also gave him hope. As the night wore on, the rain intensified, hammering against the diner's windows, but inside, Tommy felt a strange sense of warmth. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't facing everything alone. He still didn't know what the future held, but with Mr. Anderson, Linda, and now Emily by his side, he felt like he might finally have a chance. And for now, that was enough. Later that night, the diner had mostly emptied, leaving only the faint hum of the neon sign outside and the occasional clink of dishes from the back. Tommy leaned against the counter, staring into his half-empty soda glass. He could still feel the weight of the day pressing down on him, but the presence of Linda, Mr. Anderson, and now Emily had made the burden feel a little lighter. Emily had stepped outside to take a call, leaving Mr. Anderson and Linda seated across from Tommy. Linda was scribbling notes on her tablet, her brow furrowed in concentration. Mr. Anderson, on the other hand, seemed unusually quiet, his eyes fixed on the rain streaking down the windows. "Do you think she'll agree to the program?" Tommy asked, breaking the silence. Linda glanced up from her tablet. "It's hard to say. Some people have a deep attachment to their homes, even when it's not the safest place for them. But if we can present it as a temporary solution, one that gives her the care she needs, there's a good chance she'll consider it." Mr. Anderson finally spoke, his voice thoughtful. "The key is making her feel like she's in control. If she thinks this is being forced on her, she'll resist. But if we involve her in the decision-making process, she might see the value in it." Tommy nodded slowly, though the thought of convincing his grandmother felt daunting. She wasn't just stubborn, she was fiercely independent. She had spent her entire life taking care of others, and the idea of accepting help, even when she desperately needed it, was something she struggled with. Before he could dwell on it further, the diner door jingled again. Tommy turned, half expecting another stranger to enter, but instead, he saw a familiar face. It was Mrs. Delaney, their next-door neighbor, carrying a large plastic-wrapped container. "Tommy," she exclaimed, her voice warm and cheerful. "I thought I'd find you here. I brought some of my famous chicken pot pie. I figured you and your grandmother could use a good meal." Tommy blinked in surprise. Mrs. Delaney had always been kind, but she rarely went out of her way like this. "Thank you, Mrs. Delaney," he said, taking the container from her hands. "That's really nice of you." She smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "It's no trouble, dear. Your grandmother's been such a good neighbor over the years. I just wanted to return the favor." Her gaze shifted to Linda and Mr. Anderson. "And who might these folks be?" Were helping us," Tommy said hesitantly. He wasn't sure how much he should share, but Mrs. Delaney didn't press him for details. "Well, that's good to hear," she said. "If there's anything else I can do, you just let me know, all right?" Tommy nodded, watching as she waved goodbye and disappeared into the rain. He set the container on the counter, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and sadness. It was nice to know people cared, but it also reminded him of how much his life had changed in such a short time. Linda cleared her throat, drawing Tommy's attention back to her. "She seems like a good neighbor." "She is," Tommy said, "but I don't want people feeling sorry for us." Linda gave him a small, understanding smile. "It's not about pity, Tommy. Sometimes people help because they genuinely care, and that's not a bad thing." Tommy didn't respond, but her words lingered in his mind as they began to pack up their things. Emily returned a few minutes later, her expression thoughtful as she tucked her phone back into her bag. "That was the program coordinator," she said. "They have a spot available if your grandmother decides to accept, but we'll need to act quickly before it gets filled." Tommy's stomach tightened. The pressure was mounting, and he felt like the weight of the decision was falling squarely on his shoulders. But as they stepped out into the rain-soaked night, he reminded himself that he wasn't alone anymore. They were in this together. The next morning, Tommy stood in his grandmother's kitchen, watching as she slowly stirred a pot of oatmeal on the stove. The sunlight streaming through the window highlighted the deep lines on her face, a testament to a lifetime of hard work and sacrifice. She looked tired, but there was a determination in her eyes that Tommy had always admired. "Are you sure you don't want me to help?" he asked, shifting awkwardly by the counter. His grandmother shook her head. "I've been making oatmeal since before you were born, Tommy. I think I can handle it." He smiled faintly, but the weight of their conversation from the night before was still heavy on his mind. Linda, Mr. Anderson, and Emily had helped him rehearse what to say. But now that the moment was here, he wasn't sure how to begin. "Grandma," he started hesitantly, "I need to talk to you about something." She glanced at him, her expression softening. "What is it, sweetheart?" Tommy took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "There's a program that can help us. They have a place where you can get the care you need, and we can stay together while we figure out the next step." His grandmother froze for a moment, the spoon in her hand hovering over the pot. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "I don't need a program, Tommy. I'm fine right here." "But you're not fine," Tommy said, his voice rising slightly. "You're not okay, and neither am I. We can't keep doing this on our own." She turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mix of frustration and sadness. "I've taken care of this family my whole life, Tommy. I don't need anyone else to step in and tell me what to do." Tommy's chest tightened. He wanted to argue, to make her see reason, but he knew it wouldn't work. Instead, he reached for her hand, his voice softening. "It's not about them taking over, Grandma. It's about making things easier for both of us. You've spent your whole life taking care of others. Maybe it's time to let someone take care of you." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment Tommy thought she might refuse again, but then she nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "All right," she whispered. "I'll think about it." It wasn't a definitive answer, but it was a start, and for now that was enough. Later that day, Tommy and Emily sat in the waiting room of the community health center, surrounded by the low hum of quiet conversations and the occasional rustle of paperwork. His grandmother had reluctantly agreed to meet with the program coordinator, but she had insisted on going in alone. Tommy tapped his foot nervously, glancing at the clock on the wall. "What's taking so long?" Emily placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "These things take time. They're probably just going over the details." He nodded, but the knot in his stomach refused to loosen. He had spent so long worrying about what would happen if his grandmother didn't accept help that he hadn't stopped to consider what would happen if she did. The idea of leaving their home, of stepping into the unknown, was both terrifying and exhilarating. When his grandmother finally emerged, her expression was unreadable. Tommy stood quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. "What did they say?" She looked at him for a long moment before letting out a sigh. "I said yes," she admitted. "But only for a little while, just until I'm back on my feet." Tommy felt a wave of relief wash over him, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to hope. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. And as they left the health center together, the sun breaking through the clouds above, Tommy couldn't help but feel like they were finally moving toward a brighter future. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. There were forms to fill out, phone calls to make, and belongings to pack. Linda and Mr. Anderson worked tirelessly to ensure everything was in place, while Emily provided emotional support and guidance. And through it all, Tommy felt a growing sense of gratitude. He still didn't know what the future held, but he was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, they would find their way through this. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't facing it alone. Enjoyed this video? There's another incredible one right here. Subscribe now to make sure you're the first to see all our newest stories.